Anna Thompson stood at the edge of her property, gazing out at the sprawling fields of her farm. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the tall grass and the wooden fences that enclosed her beloved horses. The farm had been in her family for generations, a piece of land that had been lovingly tended to by her grandparents and parents before her. Now it was hers, and she was determined to keep it thriving. Anna was a woman in her early 30s, with a strong, independent spirit. She had moved back to the farm after her father passed away, leaving her the sole heir to the property. It was a big responsibility, but one she embraced wholeheartedly. She had always felt a deep connection to the land, to the animals, and to the simple, hardworking lifestyle that came with running a farm. The farm was located in a rural area of Texas, far from the bustling cities and suburban sprawl. It was a place where neighbors knew each other by name and where life moved at a slower pace. But even in this seemingly idyllic setting, there were challenges. One of the biggest challenges Anna faced was the Homeowners Association, or HOA, that governed the area. The HOA was a powerful entity, made up of a board of residents who were elected to enforce the rules and regulations of the community. Their goal was to maintain the aesthetic and property values of the neighborhood, but their methods often felt heavy-handed and intrusive to Anna. She had clashed with them on multiple occasions, particularly over the state of her farm. The HOA had strict guidelines about the appearance of properties, and they had taken issue with Anna's farm on several fronts. They didn't like the look of her wooden fences, which they claimed were unruly and unattractive. They had issues with the size of her vegetable garden, which they said was too large and not in keeping with the community's aesthetic. And they had even complained about the horses, arguing that they were noisy and smelly. Anna had tried to reason with them, explaining that her farm was a working property, not just a pretty piece of land. She had pointed out that her fences were sturdy and well-maintained, that her garden provided fresh produce for her and her neighbors, and that her horses were well cared for and an integral part of her livelihood. But the HOA was unmoved. They saw her farm as an eyesore, a blight on the otherwise pristine neighborhood. The tension between Anna and the HOA had been building for months. She had received countless letters and notices from them, each one more demanding than the last. They had threatened fines, legal action, and even the possibility of forcing her to sell her property if she didn't comply with their demands. Anna had tried to stand her ground, but the pressure was mounting. One evening, as she was tending to her horses, Anna received yet another letter from the HOA. She opened it with a sense of dread, knowing that it would likely be another ultimatum. The letter was brief and to the point. The HOA had scheduled a meeting to discuss the ongoing issues with her property, and she was required to attend. Anna sighed, folding the letter and tucking it into her pocket. She knew she couldn't ignore this. The HOA had made it clear that they were not going to back down, and she needed to be prepared to fight for her farm. She decided to attend the meeting, determined to make her case and defend her way of life. The meeting was held in the community center, a small, nondescript building that was usually reserved for social gatherings and events. Anna arrived early, hoping to get a sense of the mood and perhaps speak to some of the board members before the meeting began. But as soon as she walked in, she could feel the tension in the air. The room was filled with residents, many of whom she recognized, but there was a palpable sense of unease. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but it quickly escalated into a heated debate. The board members presented their case against Anna's farm, listing off a litany of complaints and grievances. They accused her of being uncooperative, of flouting the rules, and of disregarding the best interests of the community. They even went so far as to suggest that her farm was a danger to the neighborhood, citing vague concerns about safety and property values. Anna listened quietly, her anger simmering just below the surface. When it was her turn to speak, she stood up and addressed the room with a calm but firm voice. She explained the importance of her farm not just to her, but to the community as a whole. She talked about the history of the land, the hard work and dedication that went into maintaining it, and the value of preserving a piece of rural heritage in an increasingly urbanized world. But her words fell on deaf ears. The board members were unmoved, and many of the residents seemed to side with them. Anna could feel the weight of their disapproval pressing down on her, and she knew that she was fighting a losing battle. The meeting ended with a vote, and the decision was unanimous. Anna would be given one final warning to bring her property into compliance with the HOA's rules, or face the consequences. As she left the community center that night, Anna felt a mix of emotions: anger, frustration, and a deep sense of injustice. She knew that she couldn't give up, that she had to find a way to protect her farm and her way of life. But she also knew that the road ahead would be difficult, and that she was up against a powerful and determined opponent. Little did she know, the worst was yet to come. Anna had been dreading the upcoming business trip for weeks. It was an unavoidable obligation, a conference in Chicago that she had committed to months ago. She had tried to find a way out of it, but her presence was required. The thought of leaving her farm, even for just a week, filled her with anxiety. She had never been away from it for so long, and the recent tensions with the HOA only made her more uneasy. Before leaving, Anna made sure to prepare everything as best as she could. She asked her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, to keep an eye on the farm. Mrs. Henderson was an elderly woman who had lived in the area for decades and had always been kind to Anna. She agreed to check on the horses daily, make sure they were fed and watered, and keep an eye out for any issues. Anna also made sure to secure all the necessary supplies. She stocked up on feed for the horses, made sure the fences were in good repair, and even installed a few security cameras around the property. She knew the HOA had been watching her closely, and she didn't want to give them any reason to cause trouble while she was away. The day of her departure arrived, and Anna said goodbye to her farm with a heavy heart. She gave each of her horses a pat on the nose, whispering promises to return soon. As she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to go wrong. The conference in Chicago was a whirlwind of meetings, presentations, and networking events. Anna tried to focus, but her mind kept drifting back to her farm. She called Mrs. Henderson every evening to check in, and each time, she was reassured that everything was fine. The horses were doing well, the garden was thriving, and there had been no sign of trouble. But on the fourth day of her trip, Anna's phone rang early in the morning. It was Mrs. Henderson, and her voice was trembling. "Anna, you need to come home, right now." Anna's heart sank. "What's wrong? What happened?" "It's the farm," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice breaking. "There was a fire. They burned it down." Anna felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. "What do you mean, they burned it down?" "Who?" "The HOA," Mrs. Henderson said. "They came with a crew and they just set fire to everything. The barn, the fences, the garden. It's all gone." Anna's mind was racing. She couldn't process what she was hearing. "What about the horses? Are they okay?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'm so sorry, Anna. They couldn't get them out in time." Anna felt like she was going to be sick. She ended the call and immediately booked the first flight back to Texas. The hours that followed were a blur. She barely remembered packing her things, getting to the airport, or boarding the plane. All she could think about was her farm, her horses, and the life she had built there. When she finally arrived back in Texas, she drove straight to the farm. As she turned onto the familiar dirt road, her worst fears were confirmed. The once thriving farm was now a charred wasteland. The barn was reduced to a pile of smoldering rubble. The fences were nothing but ash, and the garden was a blackened patch of earth. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke, and the silence was deafening. Anna stepped out of her car, her legs trembling. She walked slowly through the ruins, her eyes scanning the devastation. She called out for her horses, but there was no response. She found them near what was left of the barn, their bodies lying motionless in the ash. Anna fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She reached out to touch one of the horses, its coat still warm, and let out a sob. Mrs. Henderson arrived a few minutes later, her face pale and drawn. She wrapped an arm around Anna's shoulders, trying to offer some comfort, but there were no words that could ease the pain. "I tried to stop them," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice shaking. "I told them they couldn't do this, but they didn't listen. They said they had the authority, that they were within their rights. Anna's grief quickly turned to anger. How could they do this? How could they just burn it all down? Mrs. Henderson shook her head. I don't know, Anna, but they did. And they didn't even give you a warning. Anna stood up, her fists clenched. They're going to pay for this. I don't care what it takes. They're going to pay. As she walked through the ruins, Anna's mind was racing. She needed to figure out what had happened, who was responsible, and how she could hold them accountable. She remembered the security cameras she had installed before leaving and immediately went to check them. The cameras were still intact and the footage was still there. Anna spent the next few hours reviewing the footage. What she saw made her blood boil. The video showed a group of people, members of the HOA board, arriving at her farm with a crew of workers. They had brought equipment, including chainsaws and flamethrowers, and had systematically destroyed everything. The barn, the fences, the garden. All of it had been deliberately set on fire. The horses had been trapped inside the barn, and no one had made any effort to save them. Anna felt a surge of rage and determination. She knew she had to act fast. She made copies of the footage and gathered all the evidence she could find. She also reached out to a lawyer, a friend of a friend who specialized in property law and had experience dealing with HOAs. The lawyer, a man named David Carter, listened to Anna's story with a look of growing concern. When she showed him the footage, his expression turned grim. This is unprecedented, David said. I've seen HOAs overstep their bounds before, but this is something else entirely. They had no right to do this, Anna. No right at all. Anna nodded, her jaw set. I want to sue them. I want to make them pay for what they've done. David leaned forward, his eyes serious. We'll sue them, Anna, and we'll make sure they never do something like this again. As Anna left David's office, she felt a glimmer of hope. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was determined to fight for her farm, for her horses, and for justice. The HOA had tried to destroy her, but they had made one critical mistake. They had forgotten about the law, and Anna was going to make sure they paid for that oversight. Anna sat in her temporary rental home, a small, sterile apartment on the outskirts of town. The walls were bare, the furniture impersonal, and the silence was suffocating. She missed the sounds of her farm, the whinnying of her horses, the rustling of the wind through the fields, the creak of the wooden barn. Now, all she had was the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional sound of cars passing by outside. But Anna didn't have time to wallow in her grief. She had work to do. The fire had destroyed her farm, but it hadn't destroyed her spirit. She was determined to fight back, to hold the HOA accountable for what they had done. And she had a secret weapon, the law. Anna spent hours poring over the documents related to her property and the HOA's bylaws. She had always been meticulous about keeping records, and now those records were her lifeline. She found the original contract she had signed when she joined the HOA, and she read through it carefully, line by line. That's when she found it, the one legal detail the HOA had forgotten. Buried in the fine print was a clause that stated the HOA was required to provide written notice at least 30 days before taking any action that would significantly impact a member's property. The notice had to be delivered in person or via certified mail, and it had to include a detailed explanation of the proposed action and the member's right to appeal. Anna's heart raced as she realized the significance of this clause. The HOA had never given her any such notice. They had sent her countless letters and warnings, but none of them had met the legal requirements outlined in the contract. They had acted unilaterally, without giving her a chance to defend herself or her property. Anna immediately called David Carter, her lawyer, and told him what she had found. David listened intently, his excitement growing with every word. This is huge, Anna, he said. If they didn't follow the proper procedures, they violated their own bylaws, and that means we can take them to court. Not just for the destruction of your property, but for breach of contract. Anna felt a surge of hope. What do we need to do? First, we need to gather all the evidence, David said. The footage from your security cameras, the letters they sent you, the contract, everything. We'll also need to get statements from witnesses, like Mrs. Henderson. And we'll need to document the extent of the damage to your property. Anna nodded, even though David couldn't see her. "I'll start right away." Over the next few days, Anna worked tirelessly to compile the evidence. She went through every piece of paper she had, organizing it into a clear, chronological timeline. She reached out to Mrs. Henderson and other neighbors, asking them to provide statements about what they had seen and heard. She even hired a professional appraiser to assess the value of her property before and after the fire. David filed a lawsuit against the HOA, citing breach of contract, negligence, and emotional distress. The case quickly gained attention, not just in Anna's small town, but across the state. News outlets picked up the story, and Anna found herself at the center of a media storm. Reporters called her for interviews, and strangers reached out to offer their support. The HOA, meanwhile, was scrambling to defend itself. They hired a team of high-powered lawyers and issued a public statement claiming that they had acted within their rights. They argued that Anna's farm had been a public nuisance and that they had been forced to take drastic measures to protect the community. But Anna and David were ready. When the case went to court, they presented a compelling argument. David walked the judge through the timeline of events, showing how the HOA had repeatedly harassed Anna and ignored her attempts to resolve the issues peacefully. He played the security footage, which clearly showed the HOA board members and their crew destroying Anna's property. And he highlighted the critical legal detail: the HOA's failure to provide proper notice. The HOA's lawyers tried to argue that the notice requirement was a technicality, that the HOA had acted in good faith, and that Anna's farm had posed a serious threat to the community. But their arguments fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, listened carefully to both sides. When it was time for her to make a ruling, she didn't mince words. The actions of the HOA in this case were not only reckless but also in clear violation of their own bylaws, the judge said. The requirement for proper notice is not a mere technicality. It is a fundamental protection for property owners. The HOA's failure to adhere to this requirement is indefensible. The judge ruled in Anna's favor, awarding her $2 million in damages. The amount included compensation for the destruction of her property, the loss of her horses, and the emotional distress she had endured. The judge also ordered the HOA to cover Anna's legal fees and issued a stern warning about the consequences of abusing their power. As Anna left the courtroom, she felt a mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and a deep sense of loss. The money couldn't bring back her farm or her horses, but it was a step toward justice, and it sent a clear message to the HOA and others like them. They couldn't bully people into submission. But Anna knew her fight wasn't over. The HOA had caused her unimaginable pain, and she was determined to make sure they couldn't do it to anyone else. She began working with David to push for reforms in HOA regulations, advocating for stronger protections for property owners and greater accountability for HOAs. As she stood on the ashes of her farm, looking out at the charred remains of the life she had built, Anna felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready to face it. The HOA had tried to destroy her, but they had failed. And in their failure, they had given her the strength to rise again. The courtroom victory was a turning point for Anna, but it was far from the end of her journey. The $2 million settlement provided her with the resources to rebuild her farm, but it also came with a heavy burden. The money couldn't erase the trauma of losing her horses or the sense of betrayal she felt toward the HOA. And as she began the process of rebuilding, Anna couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something darker lurking beneath the surface. One evening, as Anna was sorting through the boxes of documents and evidence she had collected for the lawsuit, she found something she hadn't noticed before. It was a letter, tucked away in a folder of old HOA correspondence. The letter was addressed to the HOA board, and it was dated just a few weeks before the fire. The sender's name was unfamiliar to Anna, but the content of the letter sent chills down her spine. The letter was from a real estate development company, offering to purchase Anna's farm at a generous price. The company expressed interest in the land for a new housing development, citing its prime location and untapped potential. But what caught Anna's attention was the final paragraph, which read, "We understand that the current owner may be resistant to selling, but we are confident that with the right incentives, she can be persuaded. We trust that the HOA will take the necessary steps to ensure a smooth transition." Anna's hands trembled as she read the letter. She felt a surge of anger and disbelief. Was this why the HOA had targeted her farm? Had they been working with a developer to force her out? The pieces began to fall into place. The constant harassment, the unreasonable demands, the sudden decision to burn down her property. It all made sense now. Anna immediately called David Carter and told him about the letter. David listened carefully, his tone growing more serious with each passing moment. "This changes everything," he said. "If the HOA was colluding with a developer, they weren't just violating their bylaws, they were engaging in fraud. We need to dig deeper." Over the next few weeks, Anna and David launched a full investigation. They subpoenaed the HOA's financial records and communications, and what they found was shocking. The HOA had been in secret negotiations with the real estate developer for months. The developer had promised the HOA a significant cut of the profits from the housing development in exchange for their help in acquiring Anna's land. The HOA had deliberately targeted Anna's farm, using their authority to make her life as difficult as possible. They had hoped that the constant pressure would force her to sell, but when she refused to back down, they had resorted to more drastic measures. The fire hadn't been an act of enforcement. It had been a calculated move to eliminate the obstacle standing in their way. Armed with this new evidence, Anna and David filed a second lawsuit, this time alleging fraud, conspiracy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The case made headlines across the country, sparking outrage and drawing attention to the abuses of power that could occur within HOAs. The trial was long and grueling, but Anna was determined to see it through. She testified about the pain and loss she had endured, and David presented the evidence with precision and clarity. The HOA's lawyers tried to downplay the allegations, but the weight of the evidence was too much to overcome. In the end, the judge ruled in Anna's favor once again. The HOA was ordered to pay an additional $5 million in punitive damages, and several board members were charged with criminal offenses, including conspiracy and fraud. The real estate developer was also held accountable, forced to pay restitution and barred from doing business in the state for 5 years. The victory was bittersweet for Anna. The money and the justice were important, but they couldn't bring back what she had lost. Still, she felt a sense of closure and a renewed sense of purpose. She had not only fought for herself but had also exposed a system of corruption and abuse that had gone unchecked for far too long. In the months that followed, Anna used the settlement money to rebuild her farm. She constructed a new barn, stronger and more modern than the old one. She planted a new garden, filled with flowers and vegetables. And she adopted a new group of horses, each one a symbol of resilience and hope. But Anna didn't stop there. She became an advocate for HOA reform, working with lawmakers to draft legislation that would protect property owners from similar abuses. She spoke at conferences and town halls, sharing her story and urging others to stand up for their rights. Her farm became a symbol of resistance, a place where people could come to learn and find inspiration. One day, as Anna stood in her new barn, watching the horses graze in the fields, she received a letter in the mail. It was from a young woman in a neighboring town, thanking Anna for her courage and sharing her own story of struggle with an overbearing HOA. The letter ended with a simple but powerful message. "Because of you, I know I'm not alone." Anna smiled as she read the letter, feeling a sense of pride and fulfillment. The road had been long and difficult, but she had emerged stronger and more determined than ever. The HOA had tried to destroy her, but in the end, they had only made her stronger. And as she looked out at her farm, alive and thriving once again, Anna knew that she had won not just a legal battle, but a victory for justice and integrity.